In 1939, a man worth nothing died in the city he had built when he was worth $100 million. Carl Graham Fisher, the father of Miami Beach, passed away from a gastric hemorrhage at 65. Broke, alcoholic, so desperate for treatment in his final months that he had consulted a veterinarian who specialized in animal livers. He left behind a 7.5-mile barrier island that he had personally dredged out of a mangrove swamp, a city with thousands of hotel rooms, a population growing by the month, and a granite memorial that would be unveiled 2 years later at the corner of Alton Road and Lakeview Drive. The inscription reads, "He carved a great city out of a jungle." Fisher himself had offered a different epitaph. "Wasn't any goddamn dream at all," he told a reporter near the end. "I could just as easily have started a cattle ranch." He was right about that more than he knew. Everything that has happened to Miami Beach in the 80-some years since flows from a fact Fisher understood better than anyone. This was never really a city. It had no harbor, no factory, no mine, no river, no railroad junction, no university, no seat of government, no natural reason for existing at all. It was a product, manufactured, marketed, and sold, and like any product, it depended entirely on whether people kept buying. Today, that question has become uncomfortable. Miami Beach in the mid-2020s is a place fighting with itself over who its visitors should be, whether its most famous street should be open to cars or closed to them, and what to do with buildings that are simultaneously too old to be safe and too historic to tear down. The population peaked at 96,298 in 1980 and has never fully recovered. Restaurants that once defined the place are shutting their doors. Red South Beach after 17 years, Sardinia after 20, Finnegan's Road on Lincoln Road after 25. Spring breakers arrive to find barricades, surveillance cameras, $100 parking fees, and a marketing campaign from the city itself telling them to go away. Miami Beach is breaking up with spring break, the official video announced in 2023, and one commissioner described the strategy this way: "We've broken up with our biker boyfriend and moving forward with the new one in a linen suit," which raises a question Fisher would have appreciated. What happens to a place built entirely on desire when it can't decide who it wants to desire it? The answer requires going back to the beginning. And the beginning, in Miami Beach, is more literal than in almost any other American city, because before Carl Fisher there was essentially nothing here. Not nothing in the romantic sense, not ruins, not a faded settlement, not a forgotten outpost, nothing in the actual sense. A sandbar covered in mangroves, jutting out of Biscayne Bay, separated from the mainland by water, accessible only by boat. Alligators, mosquitoes. A coconut plantation that a New Jersey farmer named John Collins was trying, with mixed results, to make work. Fisher was an Indianapolis man, born in 1874 in Greensburg, Indiana, and he was, by the time he arrived in South Florida, already one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America, and one of the strangest. He had dropped out of school as a boy because of poor eyesight. He opened a bicycle shop at 17. He co-founded Presto Light, the company that made acetylene headlights for automobiles, and sold it to Union Carbide for what amounted to millions. He used the money to build the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1909. Then he conceived and championed the Lincoln Highway, the nation's first transcontinental road, not because he had some philosophical commitment to infrastructure, but because he was a car man, and car men needed places to drive. It was that last obsession that brought him south. Fisher saw what almost nobody else saw in 1912, that the automobile was going to change where Americans went on vacation. If you built the road, they would come. And if you built the road all the way to a tropical beach, they would come there. So he simultaneously began work on the Dixie Highway, a network of routes linking the industrial Midwest to the tip of Florida, and started buying land on that swampy barrier island across from Miami. John Collins was already there, struggling with his coconut plantation and running out of money to build a bridge to the mainland. Fisher provided the financing to finish the bridge, and in return got a share of the land. By 1915, he and Collins, and a handful of partners, had dredged millions of cubic yards of sand from the bay floor to create dry land where there had been none. They cleared mangroves, laid streets, planted royal palms in rows, built a casino and golf course. The town of Miami Beach was chartered on March 26, 1915. By 1917, it was a city. Fisher and his business partners already had mansions on the island, along with 3 hotels, an aquarium, and the beginnings of an 18-hole golf course. Fisher's genius was not engineering, though the dredging was a genuine feat, but publicity. He understood decades before anyone used the phrase that he was selling a brand. He hired a publicist named Steve Hannigan, one of the first of the breed, and together they turned Miami Beach into a national sensation. Fisher acquired a baby elephant named Rosie, who was photographed endlessly, carrying golf clubs, wading into the surf, posing with celebrities. In 1921, a photograph of Rosie caddying for President-elect Warren Harding made newspapers across the country. Miami Beach wasn't just a destination after that. It was a punchline, a curiosity, an item on a list of things a certain kind of American had to see. The hotels on the beach displayed signs that read, "Gentiles only," restricting Jews, Black Americans, and other minorities from the very playground Fisher was marketing as democratic leisure. Black workers had built much of the island and staffed its hotels and restaurants, but they were not permitted to stay overnight. They carried identification passes and had to be off the beach by sundown. Whether the exclusionary policies were Fisher's personal preference or simply the convention of the era is debated, but he did nothing to change them. Those restrictions wouldn't begin to loosen for Jewish visitors until the mid-1930s, when wealthy Jewish hotel operators started buying and constructing properties. The black community would wait until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Between 1920 and 1925, the population of Miami Beach grew by more than 400%. Fisher's personal estate was valued at $100 million at the peak of the Florida land boom, a boom he had done as much as any single person to create. Properties in Greater Miami were being bought and resold multiple times in a single day. Speculators from New York, Chicago, and Detroit poured money into lots they had never visited, bidding on addresses that sometimes didn't have streets yet. It couldn't last, and it didn't. The Florida land boom was already cooling in early 1926 when a tall ship called the Prince Valdemar capsized in Biscayne Bay in January, blocking the port for nearly 7 weeks and choking off construction supplies. Then, on September 18, 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane made landfall near Miami Beach as a Category 4 storm. It drove a 15-foot storm surge 2 to 3 blocks inland from the bay. Every building in downtown Miami was damaged or destroyed. The Red Cross reported 372 dead and more than 6,000 injured. Many of the casualties came because the newcomers, people who had arrived in the boom years and had never experienced a hurricane, poured outside during the eye, thinking the storm was over. They were caught in the open when the backside hit. The hurricane didn't just end the land boom. It threw Florida into an economic depression 3 full years before the rest of the country followed. Fisher, who had leveraged heavily into a parallel development project in Montauk, Long Island, watched both ventures unravel. The Montauk project went into receivership in 1932. By the time Fisher died in 1939, he was working a salaried job for the very company he had founded. But Miami Beach survived. And the reason it survived is one of the stranger chapters in American architectural history. The Great Hurricane had flattened or badly damaged much of what Fisher's generation had built. The depression that followed should have killed whatever was left. Instead, something remarkable happened. A small group of architects, most of them from New York, most of them young, most of them Jewish, arrived in South Florida and began building. Not cautiously, prolifically. Between 1923 and 1943, more than 800 buildings went up in South Beach in the Art Deco style. Hotels, apartment houses, restaurants, theaters, a post office, a synagogue. 3 architects in particular dominated the scene: Henry Hohauser, L. Murray Dixon, and Albert Annis. In less than a decade, these men and their colleagues were responsible for more than 3/4 of all new construction in Miami Beach. The buildings were small by later standards. Many of the hotels were 2 or 3 stories, with 20 or 30 rooms, and they were not expensive. The Raleigh Hotel, which Dixon designed in 1940 at 8 stories, was considered a fairly ambitious project, and it cost $225,000. But what the buildings lacked in scale, they made up in coherence. They shared a visual language, Curved corners, porthole windows, eyebrow-like shading over the glass, chrome canopies, terrazzo floors, geometric plaster reliefs, nautical motifs. The color palette was muted, whites and off-whites mostly, but the effect, on a street like Ocean Drive, was of a single continuous composition. Visitors in the 1930s went home with vivid memories of a city that looked like nothing else in America. The word nobody used yet was brand, but that's what it was. The Art Deco hotels were, in a way, the opposite of Fisher's original vision. Fisher had built for the northern elite, big money, private clubs, polo grounds. The Deco architects built for the middle class. Their hotels were places where a school teacher from Pittsburgh could afford a week in the sun. The rooms were small, but the lobbies were theatrical, the facades were gorgeous, and the beach was right across the street. This democratic glamour, luxury you could actually touch, became Miami Beach's defining quality for the next 2 decades. Then came the war, and it turned the whole island into a stage set of a different kind. In February 1942, the Army Air Forces opened a training center in Miami Beach that would become one of the largest in the country. The military leased more than 300 hotels and apartment buildings, converting guest rooms into barracks, dining rooms into mess halls, swimming pools into life-saving training stations, and the municipal golf course, leased for $1 a year, into a drill field. At the peak, in late 1943, approximately 82,000 men were housed on the island. Clark Gable trained there. Hank Greenberg registered for officer candidate school at one of the beachfront hotels. A group of young women in the Army Air Force's communication detachment were stationed in Miami Beach and credited with breaking enemy codes. Life magazine sent a photographer, and the resulting images, rows of soldiers in khaki doing calisthenics on the emerald grass of a golf course, with Art Deco hotels visible in the background, became iconic. America's winter playground, home of the press agent and the bathing beauty, has gone to war, Life reported in December 1942. The hotel owners, surprisingly, didn't object. Government-imposed gas rationing had already killed the tourist trade, and tar from torpedoed ships, Nazi U-boats were sinking Allied vessels just offshore, was washing up on the beaches. Soldiers were better than empty rooms. The city of Miami Beach leased $2 million worth of municipal property to the War Department for a total of $6 a year. By the time the training center closed in 1944, nearly 500,000 servicemen had passed through. 1/4 of all Army Air Force officers and 1/5 of its enlisted men had trained in what the military itself called the most beautiful boot camp in America. Those 500,000 young men went home carrying a memory: palm trees, warm water in December, hotels with rounded corners and chrome railings. They had seen the future of American leisure, and many of them would come back to claim it. The military's use of the hotels had another effect, too. It saved the taxpayers an estimated $6 million in construction costs because the Army didn't have to build barracks from scratch. But it also wore the buildings hard. When the servicemen left, the hotels were returned to their owners scuffed, scratched, and overused. Some never fully recovered as tourist properties. Others were renovated and expanded, riding the wave of post-war prosperity that was about to crash over the island like a second, gentler flood. The post-war era was Miami Beach's golden age, and its temple was a single building on Collins Avenue. In 1952, a New York hotelier named Ben Novak bought the old Harvey Firestone estate, the tire magnate's oceanfront property, for $2.3 million. He hired Morris Lapidus, an architect whose previous experience was mostly in retail store design, and gave him a single instruction: build the greatest resort in Miami Beach. Lapidus, who later wrote an autobiography called Too Much Is Never Enough, sketched his vision on a napkin. The result was the Fontainebleau Hotel, which opened on December 20th, 1954, with a $50 a plate dinner for 1,600 guests, 110 pounds of caviar, and Liberace at the piano. Groucho Marx proclaimed it the eighth wonder of the world. The critics hated it. The 11-story curved facade, the sweeping stairway to nowhere in the lobby, the French provincial interiors, the cat-shaped swimming pool, all of it was dismissed as garish, vulgar, excessive. But Lapidus understood something the critics didn't. American taste was being influenced by the greatest mass media of entertainment of that time, the movies, he wrote, so I designed a movie set. He was right. The Fontainebleau became the center of Miami Beach social life almost overnight. Frank Sinatra performed there. The Rat Pack made it a second home. James Bond checked in. The hotel was a primary location for Goldfinger in 1964. Scarface would film there, too, later. For a decade and a half, the Fontainebleau was arguably the most famous hotel in America, and Collins Avenue was the most glamorous street in the South. It was not the only venue making noise. Down on Ocean Drive, the Park Central Hotel had already earned its place in popular culture. It was there on New Year's Eve 1940 that a young Cuban band leader named Desi Arnaz led the first conga line in America, a detail that seems trivial until you realize that the conga became a national dance craze, and Arnaz became Lucille Ball's husband and co-star, and that a single night at a single Art Deco hotel sent a cultural ripple that lasted decades. That was Miami Beach's peculiar gift. Even its small moments had an outsized reach because the whole place was designed to be looked at. Just a year after the Fontainebleau opened, Lapidus designed the Eden Rock next door. A different shape, a different mood, but the same unapologetic theatricality. He went on to redesign Lincoln Road as a pedestrian mall, one of the first in the country. Between them, Lapidus's buildings defined what people meant when they said Miami Beach in the 1950s and 1960s. Big, bright, confident, a little outrageous, unmistakably American in its cheerful refusal to be tasteful. But look closely at the numbers during this golden age, and you see the crack that would eventually split everything open. Miami Beach's population hit 63,000 by 1960 and kept climbing toward that 1980 peak of 96,000. The growth wasn't coming from tourists. It was coming from retirees. The same affordable hotels that had drawn middle-class vacationers in the 1930s and 1940s were, by the 1960s and 1970s, drawing middle-class retirees on fixed incomes. The greatest generation and the silent generation were reaching retirement age, and the marketers of Miami Beach, always marketers, always selling, pivoted hard toward them. The result was a population that was increasingly elderly, increasingly concentrated in South Beach, and increasingly poor by the standards of a resort city. A resort consultant who surveyed the scene in the late 1970s concluded that Miami Beach should resign itself to the facts of life and gracefully accept what it has become, a haven for retired people on fixed incomes. The nickname was cruel but accurate, God's waiting room. By the late 1970s, the old Art Deco hotels on Ocean Drive were no longer hotels in any real sense. They were residential buildings, chopped into tiny efficiency apartments, many without kitchens, just a hot plate, where elderly residents, many of them Jewish, many of them Holocaust survivors, lived on Social Security checks. They gathered on the porches each morning, walked to the beach across the street, shuffled back by evening. It was, by certain lights, a dignified and communal way to grow old, but it did not make for a tourism economy. Lenny Bruce is credited with the line, "Miami Beach is where neon goes to die." The physical decline matched the demographic shift. The Art Deco buildings were neglected, their facades grimy, their terrazzo cracked. Developers looked at South Beach and saw not heritage, but obstruction. Old, small buildings occupying prime oceanfront land that could hold high-rises. A multi-million-dollar urban renewal plan was drawn up that would have demolished most of the district. The buildings that Henry Hohauser and L. Murray Dixon had designed to lift the spirits of Depression-era vacationers were, 50 years later, scheduled for the wrecking ball. What saved them was a single woman with a degree in art history, socialist inclinations, and an inability to be ignored. Barbara Bear Capitman was the only child of German Jewish parents, and she had grown up during the original heyday of Art Deco design. She arrived in South Beach in the 1970s, saw what was there, and grasped something that almost nobody else did. This was not a neighborhood of old buildings. This was the largest collection of Art Deco architecture in the world, and it was being treated like junk. In 1976, Capitman and a designer named Leonard Horowitz founded the Miami Design Preservation League. They organized the first Art Deco festival in 1978. They lobbied politicians and developers. They held candlelight vigils and protest marches. When bulldozers came for the Senator Hotel, Capitman and her supporters tried to stop them. They failed. The Senator came down. The New Yorker Hotel followed. One can never forgive somebody who tears down a building like the New Yorker, Capitman said in a short film about her life. But the losses galvanized the cause. On May 14, 1979, the Miami Beach Architectural District was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the first time a 20th century urban district had received that recognition anywhere in the United States. The designation didn't guarantee protection, but it gave preservationists legal and financial tools, including a 20% federal tax credit for restoration. And then Horowitz did something simple and brilliant. He started painting the buildings. The original Art Deco facades had been white and cream. Horowitz painted them in pastels, pinks, blues, pale yellows, sea greens, creating the candy-colored streetscape that would become Miami Beach's visual signature for the next 40 years. The buildings were saved, but the neighborhood was still dying. Crime was rising. Tourism was collapsing. Disney World had opened in Orlando in 1971, siphoning off the family market. Wealthier residents had moved to newer condominiums farther north on the island. And then the 1980s arrived with a 1-2 punch that brought Miami Beach to its knees. The Mariel boat lift of 1980 brought 125,000 Cuban refugees to South Florida in a matter of months, most of them ordinary people seeking a better life, but a small and highly visible minority released from prisons and psychiatric institutions by Fidel Castro. The cocaine trade, already growing, exploded. Miami's homicide rate became the highest in the nation. The city's own mayor, Alex Daoud, would eventually face over 500 criminal counts and serve time in federal prison. The Miami Herald's crime reporter, Edna Buchanan, later wrote that at one point in the 1980s, she covered a murder a day. South Beach was caught in the middle, too poor to attract investment, too visible to be ignored. The median age of the South Beach population was absurdly high. The streets were, in the most literal sense, empty. When a television production crew arrived in 1984 to shoot a new series called Miami Vice, they found that they could film in the middle of Ocean Drive without blocking traffic because there was no traffic to block. There were no cars parked in the street, one crew member remembered. There was literally nobody there. Ocean Drive's hotels were filled with elderly, mostly Jewish retirees, many of them frail, subsisting on meager Social Security payments. The producers actually repainted the exterior walls of some buildings before filming because the street corners were so run down. And yet, Miami Vice, which ran on NBC from 1984 to 1989, did something that no urban planning initiative or marketing campaign could have achieved. It made South Beach look cool. The show's visual style, pastel suits, pastel buildings, sunset light on the water, repackaged the very decay that had been killing the neighborhood as a kind of edgy glamour. Don Johnson drove down Ocean Drive in a white Ferrari, and suddenly the whole country was watching. The real transformation, though, came from a different kind of arrival. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the fashion industry discovered South Beach. The light was extraordinary. Flat, golden, oceanic, the kind of light that photographers spend careers chasing. The Art Deco buildings, freshly painted in Horowitz's pastels, made ideal backdrops for photo shoots. Every facade a set, every block a different color story. Modeling agencies opened offices on Washington Avenue. Photographers set up studios in former storefronts. The clubs came next: Warsaw Ballroom, Bash, Liquid, filling the vacant spaces with the kind of nightlife that generates tabloid coverage, and tabloid coverage generates more nightlife. The rents were still low enough that a 22-year-old with a camera could afford a studio, and a DJ with a following could take over a ground floor space for a fraction of what it would cost in Manhattan. For a few years in the early 1990s, South Beach was that rare thing, genuinely cheap and genuinely glamorous at the same time, which is a combination that never lasts but always produces a golden age while it does. And in 1992, a 45-year-old Italian fashion designer named Gianni Versace walked into a dilapidated building at 1116 Ocean Drive, a Mediterranean revival mansion built in 1930 by Alden Freeman, an heir to the Standard Oil fortune, and bought it for just under $3 million. What Versace did next was, in its way, as transformative as what Fisher had done 70 years earlier. He spent $32 million renovating the mansion, installing a swimming pool lined with 24-karat gold tiles, filling the rooms with mosaics and frescoes, and his signature Medusa motifs. Then he threw parties. Madonna came, Sylvester Stallone, Donatella. The paparazzi camped outside. South Beach, the same neighborhood that a decade earlier had been described as a ghost town, became, almost overnight, the most photographed block in America. Versace propelled South Beach to a whole new stratosphere, one local business owner later said, one that attracted artists, celebrities, and the super wealthy. On the morning of July 15, 1997, Gianni Versace was shot and killed on the front steps of his mansion by a serial killer named Andrew Cunanan. He was 50 years old. The murder shocked the fashion world and traumatized South Beach, but it did not stop the transformation Versace had helped accelerate. If anything, the mansion and the murder became the neighborhood's most famous landmark. Tourists still stop on those stone steps every day to take photographs. The mansion is now a boutique hotel. Rooms start at over $1,000 a night. You can dine in the courtyard on Versace-designed Rosenthal china. The pool with the gold tiles is still there. By the early 2000s, South Beach had completed one of the most dramatic urban turnarounds in American history. The neighborhood that had been God's waiting room was now an international luxury destination. Collins Avenue had become a corridor of high-end hotels. Ocean Drive was lined with restaurants and sidewalk cafes. The Art Deco buildings that Barbara Capitman had saved were now worth fortunes. Condo towers rose along the waterfront. The money pouring into Miami Beach was global: Russian, Brazilian, Argentine, European, and the prices reflected it. Construction volume in the greater Miami area would eventually reach $27.4 billion by 2023, up 73% from a decade earlier. But the revival carried within it the same structural flaw that had defined Miami Beach from the very beginning. The city was still selling an image. The image had changed. From Fisher's winter playground to the Rat Pack's glamour to God's waiting room to the supermodel era. But the underlying business model had not. Miami Beach made money when people wanted to be seen there, and it lost money when they didn't. There was no factory to keep running, no port to keep loading, no industry that would survive a shift in taste. The Art Deco buildings were beautiful, but they were also fragile. Small structures on a low-lying sandbar, built cheaply in the 1930s, designed to last a season, not a century. And the ocean, which had always been the city's greatest selling point, was beginning to change the terms of the deal. Florida's sea levels have risen approximately 8 inches since 1950, and the pace is accelerating, as much as an inch every 3 years in recent measurements. For a barrier island that sits just a few feet above the waterline, every inch matters. Miami Beach now experiences what officials politely call sunny day flooding. Streets that fill with seawater, not during hurricanes, not during tropical storms, but during the annual king tides between September and November, when the astronomical alignment of the sun and moon pushes the ocean a little higher than usual. The water comes up through the storm drains. It pools on Ocean Drive. It floods parking garages and seeps into lobbies. The city has spent hundreds of millions of dollars raising roads and installing pumps. But the problem is not one that infrastructure alone can solve, because the problem is the island itself. And then, on a Thursday morning in June 2021, a 12-story condominium building in Surfside, a town that borders Miami Beach to the north, collapsed in its sleep. Champlain Towers South, a beachfront structure built in 1981, had been undergoing its 40-year recertification inspection. A 2018 engineering report had warned of abundant cracking and crumbling in the support columns. The Condo Association had approved a $15 million assessment for repairs, $80,000 for a one-bedroom, over $300,000 for the penthouse. The owners had until July 1, 2021, to choose their payment plan. The building fell on June 24th. 98 people died, making it one of the deadliest structural failures in American history. Surfside is not Miami Beach, technically, but it sits on the same barrier island, looks out at the same ocean, and is built on the same porous limestone. The collapse sent a shockwave through every condo association in South Florida. Miami Beach alone had 507 buildings that fell into the category requiring recertification. Officials inspected all of them within a week. None showed immediate structural danger, but the Florida legislature passed the Condo Safety Act in 2022, requiring statewide inspections of any condominium over 3 stories and mandating that associations actually fund their repair reserves, something many had deferred for decades to keep monthly fees low. The cost of compliance is enormous. Older condo owners, many of them retirees on fixed incomes, the same demographic that has populated Miami Beach's smaller buildings since the 1960s, are being hit with special assessments of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some are selling, some can't. Layer on top of that the insurance crisis. Florida's property insurance market has been in turmoil for years, with major carriers pulling out of the state entirely and premiums doubling or tripling for those who remain. Flood insurance, long kept artificially low by federal subsidies, is being recalibrated to reflect actual risk. For a property on a barrier island 3 feet above sea level, actual risk is considerable. One analysis estimated that Miami-Dade County holds approximately 26% of all U.S. homes at risk of inundation from sea level rise. First Street Foundation's 2025 study projected that rising insurance costs and shifting demand could eventually erase $1.47 trillion in property value nationwide, with South Florida bearing a disproportionate share. This is the backdrop against which Miami Beach's most visible crisis, the war over its own visitors, is playing out. The spring break problem is real. In 2021, there were roughly 1,000 arrests and dozens of guns confiscated during the season. In 2022, the city imposed a midnight curfew after 2 shootings on Ocean Drive. In 2023, 2 more fatal shootings led to another curfew and the Breaking Up with Spring Break campaign that made national news. By 2024 and 2025, the city had deployed surveillance camera networks, ATVs on the beach, license plate readers on the causeways, closed parking garages south of 23rd Street during peak weekends, and raised towing fees to over $500. Spring break rules will leave you deflated, was one official slogan. Tourists who showed up in March 2025 described South Beach as completely dead. The crackdown has also drawn accusations of racial targeting. South Beach became popular among black tourists about 2 decades ago, partly through events like Urban Beach Week during Memorial Day weekend. Civil rights advocates have argued that the military-style crowd control, pepper balls, armored vehicles, aggressive dispersal tactics is disproportionately aimed at black visitors and that city leaders are using a brief spike in violence as a pretext to discourage an entire demographic. The city denies this. The debate persists. City leaders insist this is the point. The street right now is as safe, as clean, and as family-friendly and inviting as we've ever had on Ocean Drive, Mayor Stephen Miner said in early 2025. The plan, as articulated by various commissioners and business leaders, is to replace the spring break crowd with a higher-end clientele, financial conferences, art fairs, cultural events. But the economics are contested. Hotel occupancy in 2024 was actually up slightly over 2023. Yet the revenue picture on Ocean Drive itself is muddier. Business owners at the Clevelander Hotel, an Ocean Drive institution, sued the city in 2021 over the decision to close the street to vehicular traffic, a change originally made during the pandemic when restaurants were allowed to expand outdoor seating into the roadway and then never reversed. The legal battle has been grinding on for years. A judge ordered Ocean Drive reopened to 2-way traffic in early 2025. Then the city appealed. Then the appeals court froze the order. Then city crews began removing the pedestrian plaza between 13th and 14th Streets. Then the work was halted again. The estimated cost of converting the street back to its pre-pandemic configuration, $900,000. Meanwhile, Ocean Drive keeps losing tenants. The pattern is not unique to Miami Beach. Restaurant closures have been brutal across South Florida, but the concentration along a single famous strip is striking. Beyond the restaurants, the deeper question is what Ocean Drive is for. Is it a pedestrian promenade, a European-style piazza where families stroll past the Art Deco facades, or is it a functioning commercial street that needs car traffic to deliver customers to hotels and restaurants? The city wants the first. Many of the businesses want the second. The Sherbrooke Hotel's owner said the city had been spending $750,000 a year on private traffic management for the pedestrian zone, and they've done a dismal job. Residents who loved the car-free promenade mourned its partial removal. It was a dream coming true, one said. The deeper irony, and this is the kind of irony that runs through the entire history of Miami Beach, is that the city is now arguing with itself about the same street that Carl Fisher developed a century ago, that Art Deco architects lined with hotels during the Depression, that the Army marched down during the war, that retirees sat beside in aluminum chairs during the 1970s, that Miami Vice filmed on when it was a ghost town, that Gianni Versace walked along every morning to buy his newspapers before he was murdered on its steps. Ocean Drive has been the stage for every version of Miami Beach, and right now, the stage is being struck and reset for a show that hasn't been written yet. There is a way of looking at all this: the flooding, the insurance crisis, the condo recertification bills, the spring break crackdowns, the restaurant closures, the legal fight over Ocean Drive, and seeing a city in terminal decline. Certainly that is the narrative that the title of this documentary implies. And certainly there is evidence for it. A barrier island that floods on sunny days is not, in the long run, a sound place to build a tourism economy. Buildings designed in the 1930s to last a few seasons are approaching their 100th year, and the gap between what it costs to maintain them and what their occupants can afford to pay is widening. The demographic that made South Beach famous in the 1990s, young, beautiful, wealthy, international, has dispersed to a dozen other destinations. The demographic the city is now trying to attract, financial advisors in linen suits, has not yet materialized in numbers sufficient to replace what's been lost. But there is another way of looking at it, and Fisher would have recognized this too. Miami Beach has nearly died before. It nearly died after the 1926 hurricane. It nearly died during the Depression. It nearly died in the 1970s when the buildings were slated for demolition and the streets were empty. Each time, someone, an architect, a preservationist, a fashion designer, a television producer, found a new image to sell, and the city roared back. The question is whether that cycle can repeat when the threats are not merely economic or aesthetic, but physical. You can rebrand a neighborhood. You cannot rebrand the Atlantic Ocean. The average hotel room in Miami-Dade County cost almost $280 a night in early 2026, second only to San Francisco nationally. Visitors generated an estimated $21.1 billion in spending in the county in 2023. The Fontainebleau, which underwent a billion-dollar renovation in 2006, still draws over 16 million visitors a year. There is money in Miami Beach. There has always been money in Miami Beach. The question is not whether it will disappear tomorrow. The question is what it's being spent on, who it's being spent by, and whether the infrastructure beneath it, physical, legal, environmental, can sustain the weight. Carl Fisher dredged sand from the bottom of Biscayne Bay to create the land he built on. It is not lost on the engineers currently pumping seawater off the streets that the island is, in a sense, returning to the condition Fisher found it in. The difference is that in 1912, a mangrove swamp was a problem with a solution. You threw money and machinery at it until dry land appeared. In 2026, an ocean that rises an inch every 3 years is a problem on a different scale entirely. You can raise the roads, and Miami Beach has. You can install pumps, and they have. You can require building inspections and mandate reserve funds and pass new codes. But you cannot dredge the ocean back down. You cannot pump away the tide. On Ocean Drive, the barricades from the last spring break are stacked against a wall. A few restaurants have their sidewalk tables out, umbrellas angled against the afternoon sun. The Colony Hotel's neon sign, the one Henry Hohauser designed in 1935, the inverted blue T-shape that has been glowing above Ocean Drive for 90 years, still comes on at dusk. Across the street, through Lummis Park, the beach is still there. Wide, white, blue water beyond it. The same water that Carl Fisher looked at and saw $100 million. The same water that is now, with geological patience, coming to collect.